All right, well, hi everyone, and thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. My name's Amy, and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Atlantic Regional Museum, and we're very happy to present a digital speaker series again this year. And while this event has no ticket cost, we do encourage you to make a donation to the North Atlantic Historical Society. We're a not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the collection, preservation, and presentation of local history, and your donations will help to ensure that we can continue to offer these fantastic events. The link to our donation page will be put in the chat box of this meeting. We hope that you keep your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation just to limit any background noise, but you're welcome to turn on your cameras if you would like. This presentation is being recorded and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our public YouTube page. At the end of the presentation, you'll be welcome to unmute your microphones and ask any questions to our speaker, or you can type your questions into the chat box. I'll now pass the mic over to Brian Tackaberry, Secretary for the North Atlantic Historical Society, to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks very much, Amy. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, David Smith. David Smith has been a reenactor with both the King's Royal Regiment of New York, which is a Revolutionary War era recreation, and also with a group called the Canadian Fencibles, which represents a group from the War of 1812. David has been an organizer of many reenactments and historical events in Eastern Ontario, particularly in the Bay of Quinte region, and has done extensive research on both those groups, some of his ancestors, and some of the events that took place in the region. He's also a member of the Bay of Quinte Branch UEL Association and on the board of directors for that group and other historical organizations as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Smith.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Amy. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm just going to try and share my screen, Amy, and please let me know when it comes up. Are you seeing anything as of yet?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Amy and Brian. Okay, so I guess our particular group of individuals and historians, we come from a very diverse background. We have members that are current members of the Canadian military. We have members that work at the Canadian War Museum. We have people that are educators and then as well, number of people all from various walks of life. They share a common bond, a common love of history. And truthfully, almost, I think probably 95% of the people have some form of family connection to the periods that we choose to honor. And so I myself, I'm probably 25 years in living history. But back during the Bicentennial, we were involved in a lot of major planning. I sat on the Provincial Planning Committee for a number of the events and the rather large scale, and the government of the time were very keen on supporting some of those things. And for us in particular, I've lived a good chunk of my life, and my family my girls are now the 9th generation along the Loyalist Parkway in the area west of Kingston. And so at that particular time, myself and another one of my colleagues we thought it would be very prudent on the declaration or the anniversary of the declaration of war between Britain and the United States at that time, that we go about marking and remembering some of the veterans that were there that we knew about. And we knew there were literally hundreds, but we tried to start. So we went about starting to research the area. And on that date, we marked 14 veterans that we could locate right in my particular region, which is largely Bath, Millhaven, Ontario, and then in some in the greater Napanee area. So, and I would tell you, it was truthfully one of the most spiritual things that we did during the entire Bicentennial. It was very meaningful. And sometimes I guess when you do these things, you just know that there's other things at work in it, but it did touch us and it spurred us on to do more. So interesting enough, as we started to do the research, a lot of these veterans came to life for me, and their stories came to life. And actually, I'm working on compiling a book at some point. We've marked over 50 veterans at this point, but I'm going to compile a book on some of these stories because I think they're rather incredible. And again, many of the names live on today in our region, and I know quite a few of the descendants of a lot of these people. But these are three in particular on the first grouping that we did that sort of popped out at us. So Charles Dollar was an interesting man. He was originally born in Germany, and when he came to the Canadas, he was a private in the de Watteville Regiment, which was a Swiss regiment. He died in November of 1856, and he's buried in the Morven Cemetery, which is on the Freilich Road, for anybody that knows the area, in between largely Odessa and the Napanee area on Highway 2. And so very interesting fellow. But as we got, a little deeper into him, and was able to track down his fourth great granddaughter for the day, we found out, he had seen service at Oswego and Lundy's Lane, and some of the more, certainly Lundy's Lane, probably the bloodiest engagement of the war. And this is a picture of his tombstone. But there was a great history here in that he built a lot of buildings and was involved in a lot of construction in the Napanee area. And so, the name touched a lot of what was there. But before Dollar had served in the British Army, we came to find out that he had served in the French Army for Napoleon, which was quite shocking. And but at the time, and not uncommon, if people were, and this transcends back to the Revolution, but if people were caught, they were given the choice of rotting in a prison hulk or in a prison, or going to fight in for the people that they'd been captured by. Quite often they took the latter because it beat starving to death, and it was all about survival. So there's Dollar, who had served in the French Army, probably, we haven't been able to substantiate, but probably captured, and then again he is re-enlisted, for lack of a better term, in the British Army when it comes to the Canadas, and again made a substantial contribution to the community post the war. So very interesting story. Richard Thomas Fuller, this is a gentleman that came up, an officer in the 41st Regiment, which spent a lot of time in the Niagara in the war. He actually was an ancestor of one of our former members who was unfortunately passed in the Canadian Fencibles, and he was a major in the 41st, but he took sick, and we suspect he was on the way to the Niagara, to the front, possibly to York, took ill, and then ultimately he's buried in the Trumpert Cemetery, which is not too far from the park that Brian and I have been involved in as volunteers for a number of years. So another interesting story. I'm doing a lot of research sort of on his service, and have a copy of his attestation papers, for lack of a better term, to his service. So another great story. This is Trumper. It's a very small, I won't say abandoned, but it's obviously been decommissioned, and it's in the Adolphustown area. So he would have looked very much like the gentleman here on the left at the beginning of the war, and closer to the one on the right at the end of the war. He had passed in 1813. By then they had the Belgique Shako in service, and they were wearing the gray pants. So that very much like that. Nicholas Hagerman, this is a great story, actually. This is sort of local boy makes good. Hagerman was born and raised literally on a farm that was part of what is the UEL Heritage Park and property that Brian and I do our work with, and the Bay of Quinte branch overseas. And so Nicholas was born there. He becomes a captain in the flank companies that Brock put together, and appointed a major in May of 1813. And again, we have a pretty good idea where the family cemetery is. It's on the property, if you will. We're pretty sure that he's buried there. But he dies a young man, really, at 58. But like a lot of these men that saw service, if they saw continuous service or things of that nature, then they were really broken at 50 years of age. They would have been very old in the way that they carried themselves. But Nicholas was aide de camp to Joseph Morrison at Chrysler's Farm. So obviously, pardon me, one of the battles that saved Canada, and the picture on the lower right is our unit every year on November 11th, the other November 11th, as we say. We prayed at Chrysler's Farm at 9 a.m. in the morning with the families before we make our way to the cenotaph at Fort Wellington and in Prescott for the 11 a.m. service. So this is something that we do every year. And again, a very spiritual place. I would tell you that some things have happened to me there that are very unexplainable, but you just know that it's important that you're there and you remember. So my backyard, a lot of it was Addington and Lennox, certainly. And these are a lot of the names that I grew up knowing. Amy's, Asselstein's, Booth, still there. Fraser's, Hollies, lots of Hollies. Lockwood, Mackenzie, Parrott, Stover, Thompson is my family too. So there were many of these people, and interesting enough, a lot of these people served in both the Revolution and the War of 1812. As we mark the cemeteries in that region, it's not uncommon if we mark 10 veterans in a cemetery, 8 of them served in both conflicts. Now, having said that, in some cases, by 1812, they're very aged. They're older men, but I think the blood still burned in the passion to protect what was theirs, right? Largely had been displaced following the Revolution. Many, like my family and Brian's family, from their family properties in the province of New York, only to have the Americans show up again here 30 years later and wanting to take what was theirs again. So very motivated. So not uncommon to see men that were in their 60s and even 70s wanting to pick up a musket. So some of the great stories that we uncovered in the village of Bath, where I've spent a good part of the last 25 years. Norris Briscoe, Davis Hawley, and David Lockwood, and actually Colin McKenzie, all very interesting members who all served in the Revolution for largely. So part of our services where we mark, and this is an initiative by originally the Bay of Quinte branch, which Brian and I are both members of and do a lot of work, but we've gone about marking these resting places to remember them and documentation. It takes about 18 months to do a cemetery and do the proofings that are required. There is a national database for 1812, but obviously UELAC, the Dominion, they help to substantiate and keep the records of the Loyalists. Not uncommon, we were able to find 10 veterans at rest there in Bath. Unfortunately, we could only find 4 stones. So if I can still substantiate them, they go into the national database. But there had been a new church addition after a fire, and we suspect a number of them were actually under the addition in the church, if you can imagine. Colin McKenzie's an interesting fellow. He serves as a lieutenant in the War of 1812. But prior to that, he had been a drummer at the age of 10 with his father during the Revolution. So these stories of drummer boys from 7 to 10 years old are very valid. And And I'm sure his father was a sergeant in one of the British regiments and felt it was better that Colin was with him, so at least he knew what he was up to. So from that standpoint, really some interesting work we've been able to do there. And this one's a particular grave is at St. John's Anglican in Bath. And you also see the UE metal markers that were made by the inmates at Millhaven Penitentiary. So some nice work there. So again, I sort of touched on this. This particular stone is Davis Hawley. He was buried 18 inches down the stone. And people have varying thoughts on this, if stones are lost, but this stone was recovered and now actually has been reinstalled in some rails, so it stands erect. But the gentleman I worked with at Bath United, which was originally the Methodist burial ground, he knew where the Davis Hawley plot, or the Hawley family plot was. So we went and did an extensive search, and we were able to recover the stone. And as I say, it was 18 inches down. Interesting enough, I had his 5th and 6th great grandsons unveil the stone and the marker. So know the family very well. Norm Hawley was on our board and at the park and with the branch for a number of years and did a lot of amazing work. And I had his son and Norm's grandson there to do it. So it was a special day. It's usually very special for the families. So this, for people that don't know the history on this, this is an Upper Canada Preserve marker. And there's a couple of different stories surrounding it. One that they were casting the government cast of the time medals of silver to be awarded. And it's interesting. There's some conflicting information on who was going to get them, but they were cast. And in the end, the government decided, in their infinite wisdom, to keep them. And they melted the silver medals down, but one survived. So we know what the medal was on the front and the back, which you see the Upper Canada Preserved on the front there, and it may be a little hard to see, but you'll see the lion, obviously representing Britain, and the beaver below. So they're protecting the Canadian side of the water, and the eagle on the other side. So very interesting to see that. I like that particular piece because my Smith ancestor was with his brother in a regiment. I think you might have heard of them. They're called the 49th under General Brock, but he was killed there when the Americans came across at Queenston on the docks. And then the back side of the medal is presented by a grateful country for merit. So these markers became available for the 2012 Bicentennial, so it would allow people to mark veterans. But the government, of course, put a rather ridiculous price tag on them, and not a lot got done with it. So post the Bicentennial, they approached myself and another gentleman, part of a couple of heritage groups through a fraternal organization that I'm involved in. And ultimately, we had the markers made available to us. So I felt it's been my duty to put down as many as we can. And so we've been, for the last number of years, marking, anywhere from 12 to 20 veterans in a year. So interesting enough, not indifferent from what we're doing here now at Mississippi Mills here on the 14th. A family approached me because they'd gotten my name from somebody, and I was just trying to help them get the marker down for the family. So that's how this has come about. Traditionally, I pick cemeteries, and I've got a couple coming up right now where I know there's multiple veterans, and we go about the process of trying to validate and prove who they were and ultimately what their service was during the conflicts. So September 20th or 12th, 2020, we marked 8 veterans at the Gananoque United Church Cemetery. Interesting enough, I found my fourth great grandfather in there as part of the process, who hadn't served but was an officer in the Revolution. So that was kind of interesting for me. But Cataraqui United Church Cemetery is one of the oldest cemeteries in Kingston. Unfortunately, the church is now closed. It just couldn't support, the congregation couldn't support being open, but the cemetery is protected, and another church has bought it. So the cemetery is actually still open for business. So good to know that it's going to be cared for and protected. And we jumped in on that as much as we could to be of assistance. So this is some of the pictures from that day. This is a picture of part of our regiment. So, obviously during COVID, we were practicing and some safety in terms of protocol and whatnot. And again, we take our hobby very seriously. We've been escorted to the royal family on 5 occasions. So, and I think a lot of that is because most of our guys can pass the security check that needs to be happened, but that's another story. Okay, so this is again Cataraqui. Jesse Purdy was there, but so was his father. So we ended up marking both Gilbert and Jesse, good, strong Loyalist names, but serving in 1812. And then you see the picture to the left is myself and Will Vanderhelm, who helped put that program together for us. And it was a very special day for us. On June 18th, 2021, this is probably the highlight for me. This is my family cemetery, which is the second concession north of the village of Bath, Ontario, or Ernestown, as I still like to call it. And this is the Lutheran Union Cemetery, which originally was donated by the Amy family, which were obviously German post-revolution, a lot of Jessup's Rangers there and a few Royal Yorkers. And again, we marked 10 veterans that day, and a very moving ceremony. There you see sort of the landscape of that on a hill. And yeah, it almost becomes ghostly, but it was a terrific event. Jacob Stover, here's another guy. He's a corporal for Jessup's Rangers in the Revolution, and then he's a sergeant in the 1st Addington Militia in the War of 1812. So there's a guy who in advanced stage was still doing a lot of work. So we do a lot of time, and I have these signs. So I actually, in this case, I make a point of going and putting them up. They're made for outside. I have we will have one there for the day when we mark John Donahoe, but or Donahue, depending on your pronunciation. But this gives you an indication of the things that go on. Some other prominent names: Daly, Hasselstein. Interesting enough, after we shared some pictures, I had members of both this family contact me because they had wanted to come to the cemetery and they didn't know where their ancestor was, but now they know. So very strong names in the region there that still exist today. June 19th, that same time, we went to Dauphinstown. Here's a little picture of the Royal Artillery doing what they do best, making a lot of noise. And we did the 2 cemeteries that are in our direct area down in Dauphinstown. And again, a lot of the names that are, some of them transcend both units, but these are names again: Casey, Church, Crawford, Defoe, which June and several people in our group are members: Huffnail, Hawley, Rutan, and Reuter. So, and again, this is Peter Dorland. He later would become the major of the militia in the 1830s, but this is where he's buried at the top of the hill on the grounds of what was the St. Albans Church. Now it's become a center, a heritage center, and the church is closed, but they do open for Loyalist services, and they'll be open on the 19th of June this year after we do our flag raising in the park in Dauphinstown. Again, this is the memorial wall, very similar to Upper Canada Village, if you've ever been there, where they put a lot of the stones that they moved as a result of the relocation of people on the St. Lawrence Seaway. They've done similar work here. This is an interesting cemetery. It's actually, we've had it witched. It's probably 3 times the size of the gates that surround it now. This was, forgive me, Brian, if I got the date wrong, but I think it's 1956. It's open to the public. I think Leslie Frost was the premier at the time. He opened it up, and they put a lot of the stones in the wall that's at the back of the cemetery. Unfortunately, too, we found recently in years too, we found that they put some stones down in the swamp and behind too. So not something to be too proud of. A couple have washed up, and now we have them in care at the UEL Heritage Center. So not always a good story, but anyways, the cemetery is cared for immaculately by our staff there at the park, and a couple of them take special interest in it. So again, we marked 4 veterans at that time. Last year during COVID, I was asked to do a couple of things in several occasions. One of the things as well was the story of John Baker. John Baker actually was came to the Canadas, and he was working, and his mother was working for the Ross family. Major Ross was the commander at Kingston, but had property in the Cornwall area in the Royal Townships. And both John and his brother served the family when they were younger, so they were considered slaves. But the Ross family treated John's family with the utmost respect, and in the end supported them in both their education and other things post their service with the family. And John served in the 104th Regiment, which was originally the New Brunswick Fencibles. We believe he was a pioneer, and this is the pioneer kit of the time, and they were part of the advance guard that would go out prior to ahead of the army to remove obstacles and deal with construction. And I guess we would call them engineers in this time frame. Although the Canadian Army has reactivated pioneers. One of my good friends who's in the unit up until recently was the last pioneer in the Canadian Army, but they're now reactivated that rank, and John served. So he's in the Trinity United Church Cemetery in Cornwall, Ontario. So some of the projects for 2022 we're working on and committed to, obviously Mississippi Mills, which is the burial ground where we're marking John Donahoe. Warkworth Cemetery, Stone Cemetery, and Crammy Hill are all in that Warkworth corridor. And I've been working with Bill Russell, our good friend on the board, with both Bay of Quinte and Kawartha branch. And Bill has been instrumental. And another fellow that I know, Troy Easter, who's a farmer in the region, who takes upon himself to clean headstones and go out through the cemeteries. So we've identified a number of veterans. So on June 18th, we're going to be marking them, as well as unveiling the UEL plaques at the Stone Cemetery, where there are Kreidermans and Oliver and several people that served both Revolution and 1812 again. As I mentioned, this is the one for John Donahoe Sr. He would have been, in his day, he would have looked very similar to the gentleman on the right, who was the private in the unit in the King's Own. So, so say John spent a good chunk of his life in the properties surrounding that area of Carleton Place and to the north of there. This is a shot of his stone when I located it, and again, he's remembered here, as well as his wife Frances. So 1857, I believe the date is when he's passed. And this is an interesting document. This came to me from Carol Stevens, whose family are John's family moving forward. And this is an interesting piece because it shows his record of service. I have been able to get one of these for my grandfather, my fourth great grandfather, and but his brother as well too. And it tells a story, right? It really tells a story. But these people that have been career soldiers and basically took the king's shilling to avoid starvation, ultimately get a new set of clothes and survive. But you know, by the time they're 50 years old and they've been in the army since they were 16 or 17 or 18, they're really broken men. So very tough and a very hard life. So when we remember these people, they endured a lot. So that what we can enjoy today. So, and I'm working on some other projects for 2023 already. I think I saw Lori Scott on the call here too. We're working on a couple for Lori, for her family in the GTA area. So I'm hopeful they're going to get added to the list, but we'll put certainly on a small service similar to what we're doing for John Donahoe for Lori's family when the time comes. Stone Mills, where I reside now, I found a whole slew of veterans, and again, very excited because I found one of my ancestors that served both here and buried in Centerville, and he's a Weiss, which was originally Wees, W-E-E-S, and prior to that it was W-E-I-S, but I'd say it's fair to say they're like rabbits, and they're all over this part of the world. Again, we're hopeful. We're undertaking a project, or we're having an event as far as a friendship historical heritage event in Cornwall this year. So there's a lot of appetite down there with the archives and the people down there to work on a project. So I'm going to help steer them. Interesting enough, your region, you know, the whole area around Ottawa, Richmond, all over, just absolutely full of history and a lot of those that rest there. So we've talked to a couple groups there, and just it's going to take some time to do it. And quite honestly, you know, it's a lot of energy, so you need support on the ground to make it happen. And then one that's probably the oldest one in Kingston is the lower burial ground at St. Paul's. But if you know the history on that particular cemetery, it's a cemetery on top of a cemetery on top of a cemetery. So it's trying to find people that, you know, are there, and we have records to show they're there, but they could be 2 layers down. So it's pretty powerful stuff, and we have to move slowly. There's a lot of eyes on that. So that's going to be an ongoing project. So we're working with the group that oversees all the history and the care of that site. So a lot of very distinguished historians and some really very smart people there. So it's terrific. So, and again, we talked about this earlier, the federal program, and these are the markers, and they're made of Canadian granite. Believe it or not, they tried to contract them with a Chinese company at the time. And then there was a big stink at our end. And thankfully, it's all made of Canadian granite, as it should be. So there is a national website, or database, I should say, which is the gravesideproject.ca. And we go in to that. And I encourage you, if you have somebody that's a family member, you know, something along those lines, we're always interested. I quite honestly get an email probably once a month from somebody trying to do some work, and as I say, we just try to help them, steer them in the right direction, and if we can proof them and get them in there, I'm more than happy to get it marked and get this person remembered. So we do a lot of that, and we're probably, after this year, we're gonna probably top pretty close to the 70 veteran mark of marking people once we get this season completed. So So we're literally working on 2 years in advance right now. And we'll continue on with the project as long as we can. And again, this is just an example of some of our project partners to date. I think this actually, we were at Fort Henry for the naval dedication of the Navy Bay at this particular picture. But our unit, Bay of Quinte branch, has been instrumental in helping support this, and I can't thank them enough. I've worked with a number of the municipalities and a number of the other UELAC branches in the region. And then I've served on the Loyalist Parkway Association as well for a number of years. So I try to leverage whatever $50 here and $100 here to make it all work, and the rest of it we fund. So that's my presentation for today. Thank you very much for listening. And if I would open up the floor to any questions, if anybody has any questions, Amy.
Absolutely. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask their questions directly, or you can type them into the chat box, you're more than welcome to do so now.
Dave, I had a question. The Thomas Fuller that you had done,
Yeah.
do you know if he's related to Thomas Fuller that designed the Parliament buildings, the architect?
Well, I don't, Brian,
Okay.
but that's a very interesting possibility. And because I, again, know some of the family that moved forward there today, certainly be his great grandson, Simon, I believe, but
Okay.
that involved in some of the tall ships and programs we do with Brockville and up in the Ottawa region. So interesting, but I don't quite honestly know the connection. I knew the connection to Gary Whitehouse, who was the member of our unit for a number of years, and that's how I sort of got put onto him in the first place. But we're trying to do some digging to learn more of the history around that.
That might be interesting to know, because Thomas Fuller also had an Almont connection. The old post office in Almont was designed by him as well, and it's designated a historic site because
That's a
he's
beautiful
the
building.
architect.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah,
And there's also still Fuller Construction still in Ottawa, which is apparently descendants of the architect. So
that's Simon's family. Yeah. That's
oh,
all.
really? So there
Yeah.
you go. It's probably
It is actually
Yeah.
he in his house, and I think it was the father or the grandfather actually built a complete replica of the officer's cabin of Victory in the house.
okay.
And apparently it was an exact replica to a detail.
Yeah.
Right. So I've heard about this. I've never seen it. Hope to someday, but pretty incredible stuff.
That might be a Hall of Honor connection for our Loyalists that we're looking for.
It would be a good possibility. You and I can talk later about that.
Okay.
I think I saw another hand up. Ken, was it Ken? You had your hand up?
Hi, I was just applauding, but curious. I'm just wondering whether there's any Shipmans in the War of 1812. My great uncle Luther Wellington Shipman, who wound up in Almont, had a number of sons, but it seems to me he tried to keep his own sons out of the military quite vigorously. So,
well, it's interesting, yes, because you do see some stories. I can't honestly say that I've seen that name before, but it would involve some investigation if that was the case. But there's stories like that all out through many of the conflicts, right? And so
right.
I have a picture. Probably you can't see it. It's right up behind me here, but there's the picture of the gentleman on the top behind me is my great grandfather. And he was the sergeant major at the Hill at Fort Henry. He was born in Collins Bay, Ontario, and he was a sergeant major in the 1860s at Fort Henry. And so it's interesting because that's obviously a great time of conflict in North America. And at the time, there was huge bounties being paid to British soldiers to go down and fight for families that had paid big money in Pennsylvania. So they would hire a British soldier to go down and fight in the stead of their son, right? So to avoid people, going. So that transcends a lot of that. And unfortunately for them, my great grandfather, if you look at him, we share a lot of resemblance, except he has the ZZ top beard down to here. But he's about my size. He's about 6'2" and 240. And I'm sure he would have been a really unfriendly guy to those people that were thinking about heading south for bounty. They were really literally scared to death of their NCOs, more so than they would have been the enemy. They were probably more frightened of the hierarchy within the British Army at that time. So anyways, it's a reality of it. But a lot of people were paid bounties to go and serve in their stead. A lot of that in the Civil War, especially.
Thank you.
I think Alex has his hand up. Alex?
Okay, just quite a few things actually, but just first I'd like to thank you so much for your work. I just wanted to, is Brian, I assume Brian is involved heavily with you on all of this, is that correct?
Well, yeah, our regiment really does, and myself personally, along with another couple of colleagues that are sort of experts in genealogy, we're all sort of armchair, but we've done it for a long time. So we do a lot of the work on the 1812 side, but we're very fortunate because of my long working relationship with Brian over 20 years at the park, and with Peter and Angela Johnson from the branch of the UELAC. When we get stuck, we have great resources we can call upon to find the people. And so there's a lot of, just like Brian was saying, he was talking about Fuller, it triggers a conversation, and we've just been having a great debate over a Glengarry member of the Glengarry Light Infantry that's buried in Stockdale. And it's all been going back and forth between 3 and 4 of us. And there's a great debate, but usually out of there comes a consensus on who the person is and all those things. But yeah, it's a very collaborative effort.
Yeah, so you've managed to mark 50 graves so far, and soon 70.
Yeah,
that's terrific. Just congratulations to you and everybody working with you on this. And this is not led by the government. This is led by organizations like you, right?
Yeah, well, it's our pride. We love the history. We love our Canadian history. We represent a regiment that was that served with distinction. We take it very seriously. Brian can tell you we're a little anal about how we do the details, and our uniforms are based on original. Our colors are based on originals. So we like to give people a real snapshot of maybe a little bit of what it was like, right? It's not perfect, but we're working on it. But I would tell you our work and these work in the cemeteries is by far the most rewarding that we've found. And I never have problems. It's interesting. It's hard to get 50 guys out to Kreiser's farm this July when we do the event, even pre-COVID times. But I never have trouble getting 25 people to show up to a cemetery service, right? Yeah. It's just like that. I'll be there. So,
could you give us a bit more information on John? Is Donahoe, I guess, but
yes.
You say there's been 3 different spellings of his name.
Yes.
Could you mention what those were? Because
well, the original one that I have is Donohoe.
Hoe, yeah.
Hoe. It is Donahue today. So Donahure. And truthfully, I have looked at the 3rd spelling. It doesn't come to me right now, but Carol has provided a lot of the background, the paperwork, and the family are going to be there on the day of the marking on the 14th.
Dan Donahue lives just up the street from us on Church Street, and I was just wondering if there's a relationship.
I would bet, if his family's been here a while, I bet you there's probably one branch of a tree that connects at some point. There usually is. They don't. They say that's what they say about apples. They don't fall far from the tree. So
Just the last thing, having lived up here so long now, but I did grow up, I'm a maritimer, but I've been up here
Yes.
for about 50 years now, more. I heard you mention somebody from New Brunswick, New Brunswick Fencibles. And
Yes.
you tend to forget, I guess, that there's New Brunswick and Quebec and Ontario were all involved in this war.
Well,
And
there was
are they doing similar work to what you're doing down there?
I quite honestly, I don't. I have a colleague that's involved with the United Empire Loyalists. Actually, him and I went to the same high school, but he's a lawyer, retired now in the Maritimes, and his name is Brian McConnell. And Brian makes it his work to travel around the Loyalist cemeteries down there and bring to light. He's quite an accomplished author. He's written a number of books on it. Brian's the only other one that I know of that's doing similar to work to what we're doing. But what you raise a very interesting point. There was actually 5 provincial regiments raised in the Canadas in the conflict in and around 1803 to 1806, prior to the conflict, and that largely recruited from the region. They were placed on the British establishment. At the time, none of them were given a number, but they were trained and paid as British regulars. So you have the Royal Newfs, or the Newfoundland Regiment, which of course exists today, and the same men that would later, suffer so much at Beaumont Hamel and all the legacy of what goes on there. They served as Marines on a lot of the boats and ships that were in the region, as did the regiment we portray, the Canadian Fencibles, which, I find it interesting because they were 70% Canadian. So at the time, a very strong showing from Lower Canada to defend it. As well, New Brunswick, and later they were given a number of the 104th towards the end of the war. And again, a lot of distinction. I would tell you another very spiritual event they did the most incredible march from Fredericton to Kingston in 1813 in April. And it was 66 days overland in one of the worst winters on record. They lost many men. They marched from Fredericton up the frozen water to ultimately to Quebec. They took a day and they were sent on to Montreal. They took 2 days and then they were sent on to Kingston. And we had the very good fortune of marching with the regular army. We did the last leg of the march 200 years ago to the day on April of 2013. It was the worst ice storm of the year. And we marched from Gananoque to Kingston and were received at RMC. And we did it in all original kit with our snowshoes and all of it. Again, for me personally, I'll never forget it. It was one of those things. And that day, our major is actually a captain in the armed forces. He drove from Ancaster to get there. We had people driving from Uxbridge. We had people driving all over to get to Kingston and then on to Gananoque to complete this march in an ice storm. Only a bunch of crazy Canadians would do it, right? So it's, but a lot of these guys it's a test of their mettle, and so I'm very proud to be associated and work with them all. So we've had the chance to do these things, and certainly, and then not to be forgotten, my brethren in the Voltigeurs, of course, under de Salaberry, served with this distinction, as we call them, the Bears, and because they wear the bearskin caps. But my friends in the Quebec Corps represent them, and they do a fine job, and they march with us all the time. And then as well, the Glengarrys, which interesting regiment, really big attachment to Adolphustown, because they spent largely 400 men spent 2 years in Adolphustown from 1814 to 1815, where before they were marched to Kingston and ultimately disbanded. But of course, people hear Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles, they think everybody's from Glengarry County. Well, they weren't. There was probably more from Kingston area than there was from Glengarry County. So I've unearthed all kinds of stories about these guys. Incredible stories. I just finished reading one on Thaddeus Lewis, and if you ever look it up, he became a lay minister post-war, but I think he had a couple of coming to Jesus moments, if I could be so bold to say. During the war, he was wounded at Ogdensburg, and it was interesting because he always promised to God that if he kept him out of this, he would do some good work for him. But inevitably, they would send him back to the regiment when he got healthy or healed. He was sick, very sick a couple of times, and actually convalesced at home, not too far from where I live here. And his parents would bring him back, and then he would eventually fall into the trap of drinking and playing cards with his buddies again. He talks about it. So it's a really interesting, a very hard life. But post then he becomes a minister in the area, and it's uncanny because I know all kinds of Lewises that I played hockey and ball against in this region, right? And they're all built the same, and they're all 6'3", which they talked about guys not being big. That's I'm sorry, that's horse puppy.
Yeah.
My ancestors, the Smiths, were both grenadiers in Brock's 49th, and that meant they were over 5'10" and a half. And they were big men, right? They were physically, they were shock troops, if you will. But they both escaped Ireland, beat starving to death, right?
Yeah.
17 in the family. So let's take the King's shilling and go see the world. So that's, but yeah, I mean, they were quite, by our definition, they'd be both alcoholics, right? That's what they, and trying to get through the day and the pain in the bodies and all those things. But some great stories. You get a chance. I read the biographies. I love the one on Thaddeus Lewis, and Shadrach Byfield is the one I was talking about. You read them. There's another great one on the 104th March. The gentleman's name was Lieutenant John, and it looks like Le Couture. That would be the French pronunciation, but it's actually Le Couture, and he's from the Channel Islands. And it's a whole diary of him being on that march, living in Kingston, going by bateau to the Niagara, fighting in Lundy's Lane. All these stories, and it's incredible, and it transports you there, and you're back there. So really, really good books. So if you're interested in any of them, just send me a note, and I'll put you on to the titles. And it really brings stuff to life. So.
Okay, John, I'm so happy I asked that question. Your answer reveals the depth of knowledge you have, David. Anyway, looking forward to seeing you on May the 14th and collectively hosting you after the dedication at the Regional Museum, North Atlantic Historical Society.
We look forward to being there, and it won't, I will tell you, it won't be a big contingent, but because it was sort of at the request of the family that we, but it's going to be a good size, and we sincerely appreciate the hospitality and being able to come back. And like I was telling Amy earlier, I just love going in those museums because they all tell a story, right? You can start to learn a little bit about there. So we were looking forward to it very much.
And Dave, the 104th, is that the group that went to Richmond primarily?
No, that would be the 100th.
Okay,
Brian. They were out of Dublin,
right.
and that was the connection there. And there's a ton of them, including Fencibles, and including there's a bunch of them at Perth too, right?
Yes,
Perth
yeah,
and
yeah.
the military, establishment there. In fact, one of our members, Brad Mills, who belongs there, he's retired from the Upper Canada Board. Brad.
Yeah.
He lives in an original house that belonged to a Royal Newf.
Okay.
So he's got the actual the record of service, the King's service, hangs on the wall in the house. Brad was able to save it. So great stories, right? If you can keep them alive.
And Amy, I think we have the books from the fellow in Perth that's written a couple of histories, and he talked about all the different regiments that settled in Perth. It's amazing the diversity that was there.
You gotta love a place that has every street named after a British general.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to say that out loud?
Oh,
We
yeah.
always will.